There was a question people in Dillard asked for years, and nobody could answer it. Every Thursday at noon, Raymond Holt parked his Blacktown car on Maple Street, walked past the wine bar, past the new steakhouse with the valet stand, past the sushi restaurant that had replaced the old hardware store, and pushed open the door of a place called Nora's Kitchen. He always sat at the same table by the window. He always ordered the same thing: a bowl of vegetable soup, a square of cornbread, and a glass of water. $3.50 with the tax. He always left a folded 10 on the table. Raymond Holt was worth, by most estimates, somewhere north of $400 million. He owned the industrial park on the east side of town. He owned the commercial real estate on half of Main Street. He sat on the boards of 2 regional hospitals and a university endowment. His name was on a building. People in Dillard knew who he was the way they knew the shape of the water tower, the way they knew which direction the Baptist church faced, without ever having had occasion to wonder how it got there. And still, every Thursday, $400 million walked into Nora's Kitchen and ordered a $3 bowl of soup. His driver, an older man named Sims, always waited in the car. Sims had been driving him for 11 years and understood without it ever being said that the Thursday trip was not a thing to be questioned. Raymond went in alone. Raymond came out alone. He was never on his phone. The visits lasted exactly 40 minutes. People speculated. The regulars at the barbershop offered their theories. A reporter at the local paper spent 3 weeks on the story and got nowhere. The most persistent rumor was that Nora's Kitchen was actually a front for something, that there was a back room with men and money and secrecy. But people who had eaten at Nora's their whole lives knew that was nonsense. There was no back room. There was a narrow kitchen where a woman and her daughter worked 2 burners and an oven. There was a small dining room that fit maybe 20 people. There were mismatched chairs and laminated menus and a handwritten chalkboard that changed with whatever vegetables came in fresh. If you had been in Dillard long enough, you knew who Nora was. If you had not, you would be forgiven for passing right by. Her name was Nora Simone Watkins. She was 41 years old, and she had opened that kitchen 11 years ago with $4,000 and a borrowed pot. She was lean and quick, with close-cropped natural hair she pinned back with a single bobby pin on the left side, warm, medium-brown skin with golden undertones that the fluorescent light caught differently depending on how tired she was, and a way of moving through a kitchen that made you feel, watching her, that everything was exactly where it ought to be. She wore the same thing every day: a grey apron over a white tee, dark work pants, and the plain white sneakers. She replaced every 4 months because she stood for 8 hours straight. She had 2 daughters. The older one, May, was 13 and helped with the register on weekends. The younger one, Celia, was 8 and did her homework at the corner table because the apartment above the restaurant was too warm in the afternoons and the kitchen was not. Nora had been a widow for 6 years. Her husband, Marcus, had been a line cook at the hotel on the north end of town. He died of a heart attack at 41. On a Tuesday morning at the beginning of his shift, the hotel sent flowers. They were yellow. What Nora had built since then, she had built alone. She did not own the building. She leased it from a property management company at a rate that had gone up twice in the past 3 years, and she suspected it would go up again in the spring. Her margins were thin. They had always been thin. Her soup was good and her cornbread was exceptional, and the people who ate at her tables came back. But there were only so many tables and only so many hours in the day. She worked from 5 in the morning until 8 at night, 5 days a week. On Saturdays, she worked until 6. On Sundays, she was closed, and she spent the afternoon in church and the evening doing paperwork at the kitchen table, while her daughters watched movies in the next room. She did not think about him, not because she was indifferent to him, but because she had too much to think about already, and wealthy men who came into her restaurant and ordered modestly and tipped well were, in her experience, doing something she was not supposed to understand, and she had learned over the years that she was not obligated to understand everything. What she knew was this: he came every Thursday. He sat by the window. He ate everything in the bowl. He said please and thank you, and occasionally, if she was the one carrying his food and the restaurant was not too busy, he asked how the soup was coming along. Not how she was doing, how the soup was coming along. She answered honestly. She told him the celery was thicker than she wanted. She told him when she had found a good deal on turnips. She told him once on a cold day in January that the broth had come out better than any batch she had made in 3 years, and she was not sure what she had done differently, and he had nodded slowly the way a person nods when something they suspected has been confirmed. She never asked why he came. It was not the kind of thing she asked. If you want to know what the soup tasted like, you would need to understand what it cost her to make it the way she made it. Not in dollars, though she could tell you that too. In time, in the 15-year-old habit of getting up at 5 and putting a pot on the burner before anyone else was awake. In the 2 hours she spent each morning roasting the bones for the stock. In the sourcing the farmers she drove to see on the last Friday of each month, the vegetable stands she had relationships with because she had treated the people who ran them with basic respect. There were restaurants in Dillard that spent more on a single bottle of wine than she spent on a week of supplies. Her food tasted the way it did because she paid attention, and she paid attention because she believed it mattered. She believed it mattered even when no one noticed, even when the month was thin and the rent was coming, and she was looking at the numbers at midnight and the numbers were not reassuring. She believed it in a steady, quiet way that was less like hope and more like conviction. Raymond noticed. He had noticed for 11 years. He had first walked into Nora's kitchen the winter it opened, on a day when he was having a lunch meeting at the wine bar next door, and the wine bar was overbooked and his guest had not yet arrived and he needed somewhere to wait. He went in because it was close and because he was cold. He ordered the soup because it was what was on the board. He sat down and ate it, and something happened that he had not expected, which was that he felt something settle in him, some agitation he had been carrying all morning go quiet. He had not thought much about that first time. He went back 2 weeks later because he was curious, and the soup was the same. He went back the week after that because by then it had become the thing he did. The 1 hour of the week that was not scheduled by his assistant and not connected to anything he owed anyone. He sat by the window and ate the soup and watched Maple Street, and for 40 minutes he was just a man eating lunch. What he did not know that first winter was that the woman making his soup had been awake since 4:30 that morning because her daughter had a fever of 101, and she had spent 2 hours deciding whether to open the restaurant or stay home, and she had opened it because she could not afford not to. He did not know that the pot she used had a warped lid and a handle she had welded back twice. He did not know that 3 of her 6 tables were occupied by regulars who paid $6 for soup and cornbread and stayed for 2 hours, and she kept their coffee cups full because she was that kind of person. He did not know any of that for a long time. And then, slowly, the way you learn a neighborhood by walking it in all kinds of weather, he began to... He learned that the daughter with the fever was Celia, who had a tendency to get sick in November and bounce back by December, and who had, when she was 5, once walked up to his table without any preamble and told him that his shoes were very clean. He had looked at her, he had looked at his shoes, he had told her he polished them on Sundays. She had considered this and said that was probably good, and walked back to her table. He learned that the older daughter, May, was in the gifted program at her school and wanted to be a veterinarian and had strong opinions about the relative intelligence of different dog breeds that she shared freely if you asked and sometimes if you did not. He learned that Nora had been widowed young, that she had built the restaurant herself, that she leased the building and the lease made her nervous, that her margins were as tight as she let show in the months when the soup changed and the portions grew slightly smaller and then grew back as the month turned. He did not learn any of this because she told him. She did not tell him. He was observant and he had been watching a long time. What she knew about him by the end of the 2nd year was that he was careful. He was not performing. A man who eats $3 soup for 2 years in a restaurant where nobody is watching him is not performing. 1. He was also, she had decided, sad in a specific way that had nothing to do with the soup, that he carried in through the door every Thursday and did not entirely put down before he left. She had learned not to name it. She had her own weight. She learned not to name that either. The winter that changed things was 11 years in. The February before it happened, the property management company sent a letter. The letter informed Nora that her lease would not be renewed when it expired in September. The building had been sold to a development group. The development group had plans for the space. Those plans did not include Nora's kitchen. She read the letter on a Thursday morning before she opened. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it on the shelf above the stove, where she kept her licenses and her insurance documents, and she went and put the pot on, and she made the soup. She did not tell May right away. May was in the middle of her semester and had a project due, and Nora did not want the thing to live in her daughter's head while she was trying to do schoolwork. She told her mother, who lived 40 minutes away, and drove in on a Sunday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and held Nora's hand for a long time without saying much. She told her friend Darlene, who ran the alteration shop 2 blocks over, and Darlene said what she always said in a crisis, which was that they needed to find out who they could talk to. And then she made some calls and found out that the development group was a subsidiary of a real estate holding company, and that the holding company had an address in the city but no local face. There was no one to appeal to. The thing was decided. 9 years of building. 9 years of regulars of the soup that people drove from the neighbouring towns to eat, of the corner table where Celia did her homework, and the chalkboard that changed every week, and the woman who had gotten there at 5 every morning and not stopped until 8 at night. September was 7 months away. Nora did not collapse. She was not built to collapse. She spent 2 weeks looking at her options, which were limited. He looked at other spaces in Dillard. But the rents had climbed, and what she could afford was not where her customers were. She looked at a small business loan, but her margins were too thin and her lease was too short, and the bank said no. In the polite way, that means no, regardless of what you say next. She considered a food truck, which she knew was not the same thing, which she knew was not a restaurant, which she knew would mean standing in the cold instead of in her kitchen. She kept making the soup. She made it through March and into April. Through the spring produce that brightened the board and brought the college kids back in on Friday afternoons. She made it through the stretch in May, when the heat in the kitchen became serious, and she put a standing fan in the doorway and kept going. She did not talk about the letter. The regulars did not know about the letter. She did not want to spend her last months in the space with people looking at her the way people look at something that is ending. On a Thursday in early June, Raymond came in and sat at his table and ordered his soup, and she brought it out herself, because it was a slow day, and she happened to be the one free. She set it down, and he said thank you, and she was turning to go, and he said quietly, "The note is come yet." She stopped. He turned back. He was looking out the window. He had not touched the soup. "I heard about the sale," he said. "Back in March, I should have said something sooner." She stood there. The restaurant was quiet. 2 tables were occupied at the far end, and neither of them were paying attention. "I want to ask you something," Raymond said. He finally looked at her. His eyes were steady and a little tired. "That soup, the broth you make, you started the night before." She said she did. She said she put the vegetables on to roast before she locked up and let them cool overnight, and then she got up early and pulled the stock and let it reduce while she did the prep. He nodded. "I've eaten a lot of meals in my life," he said. "Expensive ones, in places you'd know the names of." He paused. "I keep coming back because I've never had anything that tasted like somebody made it on purpose." She did not say anything. "I'd like to buy this building," he said. "Not as a favor, as an investment. But I want to make you a proper offer on the lease first, if you're willing. Long term. I've already talked to the development group. They'd sell." She stood very still. The kitchen behind her was silent. Outside on Maple Street, a delivery truck was idling. "Why?" she said. "Because I've been eating your soup for 11 years, he said. "And because the best things I've seen people build in this town I've watched disappear, because nobody with money thought they were worth holding on to. I'm tired of watching that." She did not cry right then. She would later, in the back, with her hand over her mouth so nobody would hear her. Right then, she said, "I need to have my lawyer look at anything you put in front of me." He said that was exactly the right answer. If you want to know what happened between June and September, the short version is that Raymond purchased the building on Maple Street through a holding structure that gave Nora Watkins a 15-year lease at a fixed rate she could sustain, with a right of first refusal if the building ever went back on the market. The longer version involves a real estate attorney, a lot of paperwork, and one afternoon when Nora sat in Raymond's office on the 6th floor of the building that bore his name and went through every paragraph with a lawyer named Celestine Webb, who had been recommended by Darlene's cousin and who read documents the way a surgeon reads scans. Celestine asked all the questions Nora would not have known to ask. Raymond answered each one. When Celestine said she needed a week to review the full terms, Raymond said that was fine. When Nora said she was not comfortable signing anything she did not fully understand, he said he would not expect her to. When the revised terms came back with 3 changes Celestine had requested, his office accepted all 3. On a Wednesday afternoon in late August, Nora signed the lease. She sat at the same table where she did her paperwork every Sunday evening. The one closest to the window, with the stack of documents Celestine had walked her through and a pen she had borrowed from the counter. May was doing homework at the other end of the table. Celia was asleep on the couch in the back room. The kitchen was quiet. She put the pen down and looked at the paper for a moment. Then she looked out the window at Maple Street. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the morning she had told him she was going to open a restaurant and how he had looked at her with a particular expression that was not skepticism and was not pure belief but was something in between, something that said he knew her well enough to know she would do it and he wasn't sure he had fully processed the size of it yet. She thought about how he had driven her to the restaurant supply place on a Saturday to pick up the pot. He had loaded it into the back of the car himself. She folded the copy of the lease and put it in the envelope Celestine had given her and set it on the shelf above the stove. Next to the notice from February that she had never thrown away, she opened on Thursday as usual. Raymond came in at noon. He sat at the table by the window. He ordered the soup and the cornbread. She brought it out herself. She set it down. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." She started to turn. "Nora," he said. She turned back. He was looking at the bowl. "I want you to know," he said, "that I didn't do this because I thought you needed saving." He paused. "I did it because I didn't want to keep sitting here watching something that deserved to last be treated like it didn't matter." She said, "I know." He picked up his spoon. She went back to the kitchen. Have you ever had something in your life that you built with your hands, that you gave a decade to, that asked you to get up before dawn and keep going past dark and not complain about any of it? Have you ever done that work in a room where nobody knew what it cost you? If you have, then you understand what it meant that someone did. The October after the lease was signed, the development group's project broke ground 2 blocks over in a former parking lot that had already been leveled for the purpose. The restaurant on Maple Street was not in anybody's way. It had just been in the path of something larger than its owners, and now it was not. The chalkboard outside read turnip and sweet potato, today's special. Darlene came in on a Thursday and ordered the soup and said it tasted better, and Nora told her it was the same recipe. And Darlene said maybe that was why May took the register while Nora cooked. Celia sat at the corner table with a spiral notebook and worked on a report about mammals. The question people asked, once the story got out, was why Raymond had waited so long. If he had been coming for 11 years, if he had known the lease was precarious long before the letter came, why had he not done something sooner? He answered that question once to a reporter from the paper, who cornered him at a civic dinner in November. He said he had spent a long time convincing himself it was not his place to involve himself in someone else's business without being asked, and that he had spent nearly as long realizing that there is a version of staying out of someone's way that is really just watching something good disappear because you told yourself it wasn't your problem. He said, "She never asked me for anything. In 11 years, she just made the soup." The reporter asked what the soup tasted like. He said, like somebody who knew what they were doing and took the time to do it right. By the following spring, the restaurant on Maple Street had a second table by the window. A local carpenter had built it at cost, at Darlene's suggestion because the original table was only big enough for 2, and on busy Thursdays the lunch crowd spilled past the hours Nora had planned for. The new table was the same pine, slightly lighter, and she kept it against the wall nearest the kitchen so she could see the whole room from there. Raymond still sat at the original table. He still ordered the same thing. He still left the folded 10 on the table and stood and put on his coat and nodded at her when she was near the kitchen, and she nodded back. People still wondered about him, not about why he came anymore, but about what it was he was getting out of the soup. It was the kind of thing people like to theorize about, to assign a meaning to, as if generosity required an explanation that made sense in the language of exchange. Some things are simpler than people want them to be. Some things a person does because the thing is good, and they have been alive long enough to know that good things are not guaranteed, and they have money enough to do something about it, and the plain decency to use it. And some things a person builds because they believe it matters in a room where no one is watching for a decade before anyone with the power to help them decides to look. The soup was the same soup. It had always been the same soup. Hot and deep and roasted and made with care in a kitchen on Maple Street by a woman who had gotten up before dawn to put the pot on. Celia turned 9 that March. She celebrated at the corner table with a small cake Darlene brought over, and 3 of her school friends and her grandmother, who had driven in from 40 minutes away and sat in the chair that had always been hers. May took a picture. In the picture, Celia is looking sideways at the cake with an expression of complete satisfaction, and the window behind her catches the afternoon light coming in off the street, and everything in the room is exactly where it ought to be. Nora had the picture printed and hung it on the wall near the kitchen door, next to the health inspection certificate and the handwritten menu from the first week she had ever opened. It is still there, that's the story. Drop a comment below and tell me about someone you know who kept showing up, kept doing good work, kept the doors open when nobody was looking. I'd really like to hear about them. If this one moved you, there's another story waiting for you right on this channel. The kind that reminds you that the world is keeping track even when you think it isn't. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, and situations are invented for storytelling purposes and do not represent any real persons or events. What most people never learned about Raymond was that he had grown up in a town not unlike Dillard, in a house without much, eating food that was made by women who knew how to stretch a meal. His grandmother had kept a kitchen, his mother before her. The women in his family had been the kind of cooks who understood that feeding people was not a small thing, that the act of making something good with limited materials was a form of intelligence, a form of love, a form of insistence that what you had was enough to work with and what you offered was worth receiving. He had gone far from that kitchen. The distance was measured in decades and in money and in the kind of life that required a driver and a building with his name on it and dinners where the bill at the end ran to 4 figures and nobody flinched. He had eaten in Paris and in Tokyo and in the kind of New York restaurants where you did not make reservations so much as you secured them through a chain of courtesies that required knowing the right people. He had eaten food that had been thought about and theorized over and plated with the care of a surgeon. He had eaten food that had cost as much as what she made in a week. None of it tasted like someone made it on purpose. He had tried more than once to understand what the difference was. He was not a sentimental man. He did not romanticize poverty. He understood that the best ingredients and the best technique produce the best food. And he understood that excellent restaurants were excellent for reasons that could be analyzed and described and replicated within the proper parameters. He understood all of that. And still, when he sat at the table by the window on Maple Street and lifted the first spoon of the soup, something shifted in him that did not shift anywhere else. He thought about it for a long time before he understood it. What he finally decided was that she made the soup with the same degree of attention, whether the restaurant was full or empty, whether the month was good or thin, whether anybody noticed or not. The quality of the thing did not depend on whether it was being observed. That was, in his experience, rarer than it should have been. In his world, things were performed, food was presented, care was demonstrated for an audience. He had been in enough kitchens, both literally and otherwise, to know the difference between a thing that was good because someone was watching and a thing that was good because the person making it had decided once and for all that it was going to be good. He had built his own success on a version of that principle. He had spent his early years in a city that did not know his name and had worked in the way you work, when failure is not theoretical, when the cost of cutting a corner is something you will feel immediately and personally. He had learned the distinction between competence performed and competence practiced, and he had hired accordingly, and he had been right often enough that it had compounded over the years into the life he currently had. He recognized what she was doing because he had done a version of it himself long ago, and he knew what it cost, and he knew how seldom the world rewarded it in proportion to what it deserved. He had been watching for 11 years. He had told himself he was not in the business of involving himself. He had told himself she had not asked. He had told himself that capable people do not need intervention, that she was managing, that the situation was stable enough. He had told himself these things the way you tell yourself something you already know is not fully true, the way you find language for your own inaction, because the action required would mean admitting you have a responsibility you have not yet lived up to. The letter from the development group changed something in him. He had found out about the sale through the ordinary channels of someone who monitored commercial real estate in the area. He had sat with the information for a month. He had watched himself sit with it, he had recognized what he was doing, and he had been ashamed of it, in the quiet way a person is ashamed of something they have not yet admitted to anyone else. He made the call in March. His attorney had raised an eyebrow, not at the deal itself, which was straightforward enough, but at the terms Raymond had requested, which were protective of the tenant in ways that were unusual. Raymond had said that the usual terms were not what this situation called for. His attorney had said that was his prerogative. Raymond had said he was aware of that. He thought about telling her sooner. He thought about it through March and April and into the spring. He sat at the table every Thursday and ate the soup and watched her move through the kitchen and thought about how to say what he wanted to say without it sounding like something it was not. He did not want her to think he was performing generosity. He did not want her to think he was buying something. He did not want her to feel that she owed him anything, because she did not, because the 11 years of Thursday soup at $3.50 was worth considerably more than what the building was going to cost him, on a currency that could not be deposited, but that he had been spending down 4 years in ways he had not fully reckoned until he was sitting across from the possibility of her having to close. When he finally told her, on that Thursday in June, he had tried to say it plainly. He thought he had mostly succeeded. He had not expected her to ask why. He had prepared, in the private space of his own thinking, a version of an answer that was about investment and about civic responsibility and about the importance of preserving small businesses in a community where commercial real estate was pricing them out. All of those things were true. He had planned to say them. She asked why, and he looked at the soup, and he told her the truth instead. He told her the truth. She stood there and absorbed it in the way she absorbed most things without performance, and then she told him she needed her lawyer to look at the documents. He had felt, in that moment, something he had not expected to feel, which was a kind of relief, so specific it almost had a shape. She had not thanked him prematurely. She had not been overcome. She had remained exactly who she was and demanded what was appropriate to demand, and he had thought, sitting there with the soup getting cool in the bowl, that this was also what the soup tasted like. The building on Maple Street changed nothing about how she made the soup. She still got there at 5, she still put the pot on in the dark. She still sourced her vegetables from the people she knew, at the stands she had driven to on the last Friday of the month for going on 12 years. Now, the relationships long enough that they did not need much negotiation. Just the kind of informal trust that accumulates between people who have found that the other person is reliable in the ways that matter. She still wrote the chalkboard by hand each morning. She still filled the coffee cups of the regulars who stayed too long because she was that kind of person, and the lease did not change what kind of person she was. She still did the paperwork on Sunday nights at the kitchen table while her daughters were in the next room, only now the paperwork did not include a line item for the rent increase she had been bracing for, and that absence, that single thing not having to be worried about, freed up a space in her that she had not realized was permanently occupied until it wasn't. She hired a part-time cook in the fall. A young woman named Janelle who had grown up 2 streets over and had been cooking since she was 8 and had never had anyone treat her the way Nora treated the people who worked in her kitchen, which was to say, with the assumption that they were capable and that their time was worth something. Janelle learned the broth in 3 weeks. Nora stood over her the way someone stands over a thing they love. Not with anxiety, but with attention, pointing at the reduction and saying too fast. And Janelle nodded and slowed the heat. The lunch crowd grew through the winter. Word had travelled, the way word travels in a small town, partly through conversation and partly through the story in the paper that ran in November, the one where Raymond had answered the reporter's question at the civic dinner. People came in wanting to try the soup that a man with $400 million had kept coming back to eat, and they sat down and tried it, and some of them came back, and the ones who came back were the ones who understood why. May got into a summer program for pre-veterinary students at the State University. The acceptance letter came on a Saturday, and she read it at the counter while Nora was in the back, and she came through the kitchen door and stood there holding the letter, and her mother looked at her face and knew. They held each other for a moment in the narrow space between the burners and the counter, and then Nora said, "You should call your grandmother," and May said, "I will," and she went to get her phone, and Nora turned back to the stove. The broth was reducing. She adjusted the heat. She tasted it with a wooden spoon and considered and added a pinch of something and tasted again. Everything in the kitchen was exactly where it ought to be. There is a version of this story that makes Raymond the center of it, treats what he did as the thing the story is about. That version is not untrue. He had the money and he used it, and that mattered, and he was right to use it when he did, and might have been right to use it sooner. The story that is actually true is the one that was happening for 11 years before he made the call. The story of a woman who got up before dawn in a kitchen on Maple Street and made something good because she had decided it was going to be good, and kept making it that way through the thin months and the long nights and the grief of widowhood and the strain of 2 daughters growing up in a world that did not make anything easy. She had made it with the kind of constancy that is not celebrated because it does not announce itself, that is not noticed because it does not seek notice, that simply continues because the person doing it has determined that this is the right way to do the thing and they are not going to do it differently just because they are tired or because the month is hard or because no one with money and standing has seen them. He had seen her. That was what he had to offer in the end. Not money, though the money helped, not the building, though the building was what she needed. What he had to offer was the fact of having paid attention for 11 years and the decision to act on what he had seen before. It was too late. She had not needed saving. She had needed someone who knew the value of what she had built and had the means to protect it and the sense to understand that protecting it was the right thing to do. That Thursday in late October, the first one after the new table went in, Nora was in the kitchen when she heard the bell over the door. She did not need to look up to know. She heard the particular weight of the step, the sound of the chair at the window table being pulled back. She ladled the soup into the bowl. 1. She cut the cornbread in the way she always cut it, a square and clean, and set it on the plate beside the bowl. She poured the water. She carried it out herself. She set it down in front of him. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." She went back to the kitchen. The restaurant was half full, a good Thursday crowd, the regular faces and a few new ones who had driven in from the next town over. The chalkboard said, "Sweet potato and ginger today," a recipe she had been working on since September and felt right about. Janelle was at the second burner. Celia was at the corner table with her notebook. The window caught the October light coming in off the street. Nora picked up a wooden spoon and tasted the broth and adjusted the heat. She had been doing this for 12 years. She would do it tomorrow and the day after that. The pot on the stove was the same pot, rehandled now for the 3rd time, the base darkened from years of use, the interior seasoned in ways she could not have replicated with a new pot. She had carried it from the supply store herself with Marcus on a Saturday afternoon a long time ago. She kept it because it was the right pot. She kept it because some things earned the right to stay.